The illusion of security in Western capitals relies on a profound, almost pathological misunderstanding of how sovereign nation-states respond to existential peril. When you spend decades pushing a pivotal regional power into a corner, explicitly threatening regime change and openly dangling the specter of total national liquidation, you do not induce submission. You engineer an absolute non-negotiable imperative for the ultimate deterrent. As someone who has spent a lifetime examining the raw mechanics of nuclear delivery systems and advising on national security policy, I view the current consensus on the Iranian nuclear question with a mixture of weariness and severe cynicism. The foreign policy establishment operates on a template of manufactured consensus and structural hypocrisy, entirely blind to the highly disciplined, rational calculations of the adversaries they seek to dismantle. Let us strip away the moralizing rhetoric and examine the geopolitical board as it actually exists. For years, the strategic objective of the United States and its principal regional proxy has been the subversion and eventual collapse of the governing architecture in Tehran. But we must be brutally honest about the structural reality of such an objective. There is no alternative administration waiting in the wings to seamlessly inherit the levers of state power. The forced removal of the current authority would not yield a stable Western-aligned enclave. It would trigger the immediate balkanization, fragmentation, and utter destruction of the country. We are talking about a catastrophic unraveling along the lines of what we deliberately inflicted upon Libya and Syria, where ancient societies were reduced to fractured landscapes of perpetual warfare. For the leadership sitting in Tehran, this is not an academic debate. It is a clear and present existential reality. They must operate under the entirely logical assumption that their adversaries will never voluntarily abandon the goal of their erasure. When faced with a threat of this magnitude, any rational actor is forced to seek the ultimate guarantee of state survival. Why do our policymakers continue to believe that escalating military coercion will produce anything other than absolute defiance? And, how can an establishment that presided over 2 decades of unmitigated disaster in Afghanistan, spending trillions of dollars only to replace the Taliban with the Taliban, convince itself that it can successfully manage the violent destabilization of an immensely more sophisticated, industrially capable nation? Are we truly so blinded by our own exceptionalism that we cannot see the direct causal link between our campaigns of maximum pressure and the overwhelming incentive we've created for nuclear weaponization? The mainstream narrative routinely characterizes the defensive maneuvers of the global South as irrational, yet the historical record reveals a deeply disciplined pattern of behavior. The primary objective of the state in question is not the aggressive employment of catastrophic weaponry, but the establishment of a credible counterweight to an adversarial architecture that has demonstrated a complete disregard for international law. Look at the surrounding landscape. The actions of regional actors have demonstrated an existential, highly destructive ambition that borders on territorial restructuring through sheer force. When an asymmetric power observes its neighbors exercising unchecked military violence underwritten by the world's dominant superpower, the pursuit of strategic parity ceases to be a luxury. It becomes the foundational requirement of national longevity. Yet, despite this severe pressure, the leadership we are told to fear has consistently demonstrated a level of strategic restraint and diplomatic rationality that is conspicuously absent in Western capitals. They understand with perfect clarity that entering the nuclear club has profound cascading regional consequences. They are fully aware that if they finalize a functional nuclear arsenal, neighboring powers like Saudi Arabia will immediately move to secure their own strategic capabilities, likely utilizing long-standing financial and technological arrangements with existing nuclear states like Pakistan. They know that Turkey and Egypt would inevitably follow, transforming Southwest Asia into a highly volatile, multipolar nuclear landscape that would fundamentally complicate their own security architecture. And this awareness explains why they have repeatedly signaled a willingness to enter into highly restrictive, verified diplomatic frameworks, such as the 2015 joint agreement, sacrificing aspects of their enrichment capacity in exchange for economic integration and formal sovereignty. The tragedy of contemporary Western statecraft is its inability to comprehend an adversary that acts out of cold defensive realism. By systematically closing every avenue of diplomatic recourse through treaty repudiation and economic strangulation, the international architecture is driving a highly capable state into a corner where the perceived cost of non-weaponization outstrips the risks of proliferation. We are witnessing the slow, predictable fracturing of the unipolar order, not because the global south is inherently aggressive, but because the systemic hypocrisy of the dominant powers leaves no alternative path for survival. To understand the sheer gravity of this impasse, we must discard the superficial assessments circulating in Washington and look directly at the hard engineering realities. The conventional wisdom peddled by the expert consensus suggests that from the existing stockpile of roughly 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium hexafluoride, a nation could rapidly produce perhaps 10 nuclear weapons. But this estimate rests on a profoundly flawed conservative assumption that a functional atomic bomb requires 25 kilograms of highly enriched weapons-grade material. As an analyst who looks at these systems through a lens of technical feasibility rather than political convenience, I can tell you that this assumption is fundamentally wrong. They do not need 25 kilograms of highly enriched uranium to construct a devastating, reliable weapon. A highly sophisticated adversary operating under existential threat will optimize their designs based on basic laws of physics that the Western policy class routinely overlooks. By employing an elegant and straightforward engineering solution, a state can construct a highly effective weapon using only 14 or 15 kilograms of weapons-grade material. How does a nation achieve this without undergoing an extensive observable testing regime? So the answer lies in a design that utilizes a hollow sphere of weapons-grade uranium enveloped by a massive external shell of uranium-238. This external sphere provides two massive compounding technical advantages. First, it acts as a highly efficient neutron reflector, bouncing escaping neutrons directly back into the fissioning core. This drastically reduces the required critical mass of uranium-235, instantly doubling the potential size of the arsenal from the same volume of raw feedstock. Second, the immense mass of this uranium-238 tamper provides vital inertial confinement. When an atomic device begins its explosive release of energy, the ultimate yield depends entirely on how long the core can stay together before the sheer heat forces its physical disassembly. By using a heavy tamper to delay the outward expansion of the weapon by even a few hundredths of a millionth of a second, the fission efficiency skyrockets, producing a substantially higher explosive yield. Why do our strategic planners refuse to look at these basic physics equations? Are they truly so arrogant that they assume an adversary facing total national destruction will prioritize complex, untested implosion mechanisms over an entirely reliable brute force gun assembly or basic tamp design that works perfectly the first time? The immediate counter-argument from the establishment is that such a heavily tamp design produces a weapon that is mechanically heavy, rendering it unfeasible for modern deployment. This is another layer of comforting misinformation. When you calculate the physical weight of a 15-kilogram core combined with a 10-centimeter uranium-238 reflector, the entire nuclear package weighs somewhere around 350 kilograms. Even when you factor in an additional 100 kilograms for the necessary electronic firing packages, fusing mechanisms, and structural housing, the total weight comes to approximately 450 kilograms. For a nation that has spent decades perfecting an expansive, highly resilient domestic missile program, a 450 kilogram payload is trivial. This exact payload envelope fits seamlessly onto existing, thoroughly tested long-range ballistic missiles. the very same platforms that have already been deployed in conventional strikes across the region. Furthermore, we must confront an even more uncomfortable truth regarding the supposed invulnerability of Western-supplied defense architectures. The prevailing narrative insists that advanced anti-ballistic missile systems provide an impenetrable shield against such threats. Having reviewed the granular empirical data from historical missile engagements, I must tell you that this shield is largely an illusion. The Patriot missile system has demonstrated a near-zero capability to successfully intercept these specific classes of heavy, fast-moving ballistic missiles. The real-world data shows an almost total failure to engage these targets effectively, meaning that if a conflict escalates, the delivery mechanism is profoundly reliable. If the defense systems designed to protect regional assets are functionally near useless against these vectors, what exactly is the plan if deterrence fails? How can Washington justify spending billions of taxpayer dollars to replenish interceptors that are technically incapable of stopping the very weapons they are meant to engage? This technical disparity transforms a theoretical debate into an immediate reality where a military option is a mathematical impossibility. The structural failure of missile defense systems is merely the external symptom of a much deeper, far more systemic miscalculation. To truly grasp the inevitability of this unfolding crisis, we must look past the delivery vectors and examine the hidden acceleration occurring within the enrichment cascades themselves. For years, the Western expert class has comforted itself with static, theoretical models of industrial capacity, entirely ignoring the empirical realities documented on the ground. When you analyze the raw data released by the International Atomic Energy Agency, specifically the monitoring reports detailing operations at the highly fortified Fordo facility, the narrative of a slow, technically constrained program completely disintegrates. The fundamental error lies in the chronic underestimation of centrifuge efficiency. For a considerable duration, conventional assessments, including my own initial calculations, operated under the assumption that the advanced IR-6 gas centrifuges possessed a separative work unit capacity of somewhere between 3.5 and 7 units per machine annually. This was a guess, an inference drawn by analysts attempting to decipher a complex mechanical device without direct access to real-world experimental outcomes. However, the data officially recorded by international inspectors has shattered these conservative baselines. In a series of highly sophisticated operations, technicians demonstrated the ability to link separate centrifuge cascades together, coupling two distinct units of 174 machines into a unified 348 machine double cascade. And the operational results of this configuration are staggering. By feeding 20% enriched uranium hexafluoride into one end of this combined cascade, they successfully produced 34 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium hexafluoride in a single month. To anyone who understands the precise chemistry of enrichment, this is not a minor achievement. It is a definitive demonstration of advanced industrial mastery. To yield 34 kilograms of 60% material from a 20% feed requires roughly 369 separative work units of effort per month. When you annualize this figure, this single modest cascade generates over 4,400 separative work units per year. Do the math, divide that output by the 348 machines in operation, and you find that each individual IR-6 centrifuge is functioning at an efficiency of 12.75 separative work units. How did the entire Western intelligence apparatus manage to overlook a technological leap of this magnitude? Why do our strategic planners continue to rely on obsolete performance models when the verifiable data points to an enrichment capability that is nearly 4 times more powerful than previously admitted? The answer is as old as hegemony itself, an establishment blinded by its own sense of cultural and technological superiority cannot conceive of an adversary solving complex engineering problems with such disciplined efficiency. This massive divergence between reality and institutional consensus brings us to the profound irresponsibility of the Western intellectual gatekeepers. Consider organizations like the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which have long been treated as the ultimate arbiters of nuclear risk. In reality, these institutions have largely degenerated into elite social clubs, completely insulated from the rigorous demands of hard technical analysis. They exist to perpetuate a specific, highly political brand of misinformation, publishing comforting essays that minimize the technical readiness of independent states. I have personally confronted the executive leadership of these organizations, presenting them with the irrefutable mathematical evidence of this accelerated centrifuge capacity. The response was a chilling display of bureaucratic indifference and an absolute refusal to engage with the actual data. They're simply too busy managing their public profiles and maintaining their proximity to power to bother understanding the physical realities of the systems they claim to critique. What happens when a global empire constructs its entire foreign policy framework upon a foundation of curated fictions designed to preserve its own psychological comfort? It guarantees that when the strategic surprise finally arrives, the shock will be absolute and unmanageable. By telling policymakers that an independent state lacks the sophisticated know-how to rapidly cross the nuclear threshold, these intellectual gatekeepers provide a false sense of security that actively encourages further military adventurism. They tell the political class what it wants to hear, that maximum pressure can be sustained indefinitely without triggering an immediate, irreversible counter response. Meanwhile, the internal political dynamics within the targeted state are reaching a critical tipping point. The domestic debates in Tehran are complex, fluid, and highly volatile. The disciplined, rational actors who currently argue that formal weaponization would undermine national security are being systematically undermined by our own actions. Every time the West defaults to threats of destruction, we hand an unassailable argument to the internal factions demanding an immediate, overt breakout. To appreciate why this technical acceleration is so devastating, one must understand the exponential nature of uranium enrichment. And the process is not a linear climb, it is a steep compounding curve. When I explain this to audiences, I often use a basic analogy. Imagine a solution of sugar mixed with water, where you are boiling off a constant volume of liquid in every cycle. In the beginning, when the concentration is low, you must expend an immense amount of energy and time just to filter out the raw material. But as you progress to higher states of purity, the solution becomes highly concentrated. By the time you reach 60% enrichment, the vast majority of the industrial labor has already been completed. The remaining step, moving from 60% to 90% weapons grade material, requires an incredibly trivial fraction of total effort. Let us look at the precise metrics derived from this physical law. With a single cascade of 348 IR6 centrifuges generating over 4,400 separative work units annually, a nation requires a mere 120 work units to extract 25 kilograms of highly enriched uranium from a 60% enriched feed. Do you comprehend the timeline we're talking about here? It is approximately 1.4 weeks. If the design is optimized to use the lighter 14-kilogram core I outlined earlier, that window shrinks to a mere 5 or 6 days per device. This means that from their existing stockpile of 440 kilograms of 60% material, they possess the immediate capacity to manufacture between 15 and 19 functional atomic weapons. This is the reality that the self-appointed experts in Washington dismiss as a distant threat. They confidently assure the public that a breakout would take years, entirely blind to the fact that the material is already sitting in facilities, waiting only for the final brief mechanical processing. This is not a minor computational error. It is a reckless systemic failure of intelligence that actively paralyzes realistic decision-making. If our leadership is being counseled by technical advisors who cannot interpret a basic enrichment curve, How can we expect anything other than catastrophic strategic surprise? This brings us directly to the profound intellectual arrogance and underlying ethnocentric bias that characterizes the entire Western strategic discourse. There is a deeply rooted, almost reflexive assumption within the imperial architecture that independent nations in the global South are inherently incapable of managing complex strategic dynamics. I am reminded of the deeply cynical debates that filled the halls of Congress during the tenure of Secretary of Defense Les Aspin in the wake of the Black Hawk Down incident in Africa. The policy establishment engaged in an explicitly patronizing debate centered around a single absurd question. Are these leaders rational enough to be deterred? Are they sufficiently civilized to understand the concept of mutual destruction? Or are they uniquely driven by fanatical impulses? How can an establishment that views the world through such a narrow, exceptionalist lens ever hope to formulate effective policy? The historical record demonstrates that the true anomalies of irrationality, those leaders willing to see their entire nations reduced to ash rather than accept defeat, have emerged directly from the heart of the Western world. When Germany was collapsing, it was Adolf Hitler who ordered the total destruction of his own country's infrastructure, declaring that the population had failed his test of superiority and deserved to perish. Conversely, even the most brutal figures of the non-Western world, whether it was Joseph Stalin or Mao Zedong, operated with a cold, calculating adherence to the laws of deterrence. They understood power, they understood consequences, and they never crossed the threshold of mutual annihilation. Yet the Western elite continues to project its own historic capacity for total irrationality onto adversaries who have shown nothing but immense tactical discipline. Look at the absolute wreckage of our own imperial interventions over the last quarter century. We spent 20 years in Afghanistan, sacrificing thousands of lives and squandering trillions of dollars, only to achieve the spectacular result of replacing the Taliban with the Taliban. And we dismantled the state apparatus in Iraq under false pretenses, achieving nothing but the total destruction of a regional counterweight and forcing the country into a direct strategic alignment with Tehran. We liquidated the governing structure of Libya, transforming a stable nation into a fractured open-air weapons market and a permanent security nightmare for the European continent. We repeated the script in Syria, leaving behind a scarred landscape where extremist groups thrive in the vacuum of collapsed authority. None of these campaigns yielded stability, democracy, or security. Why do the architects of these historic disasters believe that a military campaign against an immensely more capable, technologically advanced state would produce anything other than total geopolitical ruin? The delusion of an impregnable technological shield is perhaps the most dangerous component of contemporary strategic planning. I'm preparing to present a comprehensive data-driven analysis in Warsaw detailing the actual operational performance of Western missile defense frameworks from the 1991 Gulf War to the contemporary era. The findings are completely unsparing. We are currently witnessing a massive multi-billion-dollar misallocation of resources where taxpayers are funding the replenishment of interceptor stockpiles that real-world data proves are functionally near useless against advanced ballistic trajectories. If a conflict escalates to the point where an incoming missile carries a catastrophic payload, the existing defense architecture will not stop it. Why does the political class continue to project an aura of total defense when the empirical data points to near zero capability? Are we truly willing to gamble the survival of entire populations on the unverified marketing claims of defense contractors? This systemic refusal to engage with physical reality is why the discourse surrounding a military solution to the nuclear question is so profoundly reckless. As someone who was intimately involved in tactical war planning, who sat before the computing systems and analyzed exactly where the ground zeros were laid down, I do not view these scenarios with the detached enthusiasm of a think tank academic. I have seen the granular mechanics of mass destruction. when modern policymakers or retired generals casually suggest that an air campaign can permanently erase the internalized knowledge and industrial capacity of a sovereign nation, my immediate response is always the same. Show me the plan. Show me exactly how you execute this strike without triggering a regional conflagration that fundamentally destabilizes the global economy. I am not a dogmatic pacifist. I am well aware of St. Augustine's classical criteria for a just war, which argues that a military intervention can be morally justified if it is deployed as an absolute last resort to prevent a demonstrably greater evil. But the fatal flaw that modern strategic thinkers ignore is the inherent unpredictability of warfare. You can never guarantee that the lesser evil you choose to unleash will not rapidly spiral out of control, ultimately manifesting a catastrophic reality that dwarfs the original threat. In the context of a highly capable, deeply integrated regional power, a military intervention is a complete illusion. Any attempt to implement a violent solution will merely provide the absolute, unassailable justification for rapid, overt weaponization. We must look at the strategic chessboard with total clarity. The alternative to a negotiated settlement is not a non-nuclear state. The alternative is a highly weaponized, intensely defiant nation surrounded by a ring of newly proliferated regional powers who felt compelled to follow suit. Who is safer in that world? Is the long-term security of a resident in Tel Aviv, Riyadh, or Istanbul enhanced by transforming the entirety of Southwest Asia into a volatile, multipolar nuclear landscape operating on a hair trigger? Like, the calculus is so clear, so foundational, that it requires a complete abdication of intellect to see any path forward other than realistic, sustained diplomacy. A kindergarten child, when presented with the plain structural outcomes of these two distinct choices, would look at the board and choose the path of mutual restraint. Yet the self-appointed geniuses in Washington remain paralyzed by their own moralizing rhetoric, entirely unable to execute basic statecraft. They prefer to substitute psychological comfort for empirical reality, relying on an elite class of technical gatekeepers who propagate false baselines to maintain their proximity to power. This is not a minor bureaucratic error. It is a profound historical tragedy. By systematically closing every diplomatic exit ramp and defaulting to an unyielding policy of economic strangulation and explicit threats of state erasure, the West is actively engineering the very proliferation it claims to prevent. We are watching the slow, inexorable fragmentation of the unipolar order, a collapse brought about not by the inherent malice of the global South, but by the systemic hypocrisy and intellectual decay of the dominant imperial powers. When an empire loses the capacity to understand the rational calculations of its adversaries, it seals its own fate. The transition to a multipolar world is no longer a distant theoretical prediction. It is an active reality being forged in the crucible of these very crises. True stability cannot be achieved through the projection of an imaginary technological superiority or the perpetual threat of regime change. It requires the courage to acknowledge that sovereign nations will always prioritize their own survival above the dictates of an external hegemon. If we refuse to learn this lesson, the laws of physics and history will inevitably enforce it for us. What do you think will happen next? Will Western capitals finally embrace a realistic diplomatic framework, or will institutional arrogance drive the region over the precipice of a permanent nuclear arms race? Let me know in the comments below.